notion of this quiet moment where you have to listen.
Recall is extremely important.
Yeah.
In other words, we have memory, we have short-term, we have long-term memory. Many subjects, excuse me, the message will go in, you'll receive it, and it'll be cast out by the brain because you've already got the message, and it's of has very little meaning to the person receiving it. In other words, if you're standing in the street and a huge truck is bearing down on you and it makes a blast of a horn and he's fairly close and you jump out of the way, barely escaping with your life, you're going to remember that all your life. You've got a neural pathway established that's going to be there as long as you're alive. But the learning experience in something that's of a commonplace nature and so forth very quickly can leave. Now here we're challenging people who are in a new subject. Mm-hmm. Now I've had people who were tone deaf. I mean, to the extent that at that period in our time they were thought to be tone deaf. I never agreed with it, but that's what was happening at the time that I started this program. Mm-hmm. And I started to study this. That's when I really went into the brain activity a great deal. And I found there's a couple of boys today that are working with orchestras, making a fine living, who they would qualify as tone deaf because they could not respond to a note. If I asked them to sing it, they could not do it. They couldn't even come close.
Oh my.
Yeah. And we would start a program where we would bring in the multiplicity of senses right away, the sense of sight, the sense of sound, where possible, even feel, and so forth. But always basic to this was a sound source followed by silence. The period of silence is to establish recall. Now this, like any other skill, this begins to develop as an ability. And at first it's not really there.
Yeah.
And many times, even when it's in their head, they can't signal with their vocal cords because as soon as they want to sing, they immediately try to take charge of the muscular region, and the message goes right out the brain. They think it's there, but it's not. Mm-hmm. They have no message at the time they're trying to get the vibratory rate started up in their mechanisms. So we immediately begin to counter this with the use of words, use of message, so that it becomes from the person we're working with to his audience. We always put him in, because to influence the external environment, you must use motor systems.
Yeah.
You use sensory systems to acquire knowledge, but you use motor systems to impart knowledge. These people are using sensory systems to try to impart it. They're setting up mechanisms in the region of the throat and how to do rather than how to sound. So I found that it was very productive to work where they had these periods of silence where they could train the brain into recalling the sounds, to be able to think musical messages in silence. These people have never done that. Mm-hmm. You'd think this would be commonplace because most of us do it without any encouragement from anybody. But some people, they might be marvelous in math, they might be marvelous in logic, but they just have not developed as a child around the sound. Mm-hmm. In other words, around music and so forth. Mm-hmm. I grew up where we had a great deal of music in our family, and was exposed to it from the time I was born, actually. Mm-hmm. Probably prenatal as well, sure. But always music. Mm-hmm. And so the ability to recognize sound and to rehear, not in silence in my head, to hear all of this was very, very great in me, as long as I can remember. I took it for granted that everybody had that. Mm-hmm. But in questioning varieties of people, I found that there are people that this is very far from their abilities, So we start where a person can begin to acquire knowledge, not from a level that he cannot cope with. Very important that If he can't run, you start where he walks. If he can't walk, you start where he can crawl. And in the cases I would be doing, I would start with single notes. I'd question him and find out if anything from school stayed in the brain of the person. In other words, any like this anthem or anything like that. Usually there was some piece buried somewhere where there were a few notes that would stay in tune. And that's why I suspected we had something to work with. It turned out that I was right, that we did have something to work with. And immediately the growth would start. And I would use a tape recorder. These were first coming out at that time. They were first coming on scene. The old ones. And a piano. And I wouldn't bother with their instrument in this particular training, but just make it a simple little thing where we play one note, and he would have to indicate recognition and ability of recall, and either through humming or whistling, or if necessary, playing it on the tuba, fishing it out, you know. But very quickly that ability would grow.
Do you think it's because many teachers concentrate so much on the repetitive aspect of the technique? If you're not getting it, like this young man, if you're not getting it, well, you just got to do it over and over again. And you don't think about it, but you just, at random, without thinking, without letting it recall, you just practice the technique, and it never
This
gets
is one
better.
way, and as I say, it's the least productive, because eventually, the repetition, it'll start to form a neural pathway. It'll start to come, but
It takes longer,
it's so much
doesn't it?
longer.
Yes.
It's much better, you know, if you simply play the notes, but very slow. And again, one by one, establish the pitches in your brain, and just take them out of context and find what pitch you're playing, but so that you can recall it. It's very important, because when we play, we cannot play by phrase. This is the strange thing. You singers don't have to worry about this so much, because you're using a variety of words. And usually this protects you, because you'll find each word provides its own stimuli.
Unfortunately, though, so many times you hear the same stress on every syllable just as unmusically as you're playing one note on a piano at a time, you know.
Well, you know, on the brass instrument, they start to play by blowing and fingering. And the first thing you know, they're blowing against the embouchure and they're fingering, but the brain is not sending anything out. There is no stimuli, they're hearing instead. And then the missed notes come in. These are in some advanced players even. And music, they know, they're always missing a note. Now all you have to do is, just like the singer, make sure that each pitch has its own stimulus. Now with words you can do that.
That's true.
I love you so. If you just play da 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 da, maybe it'll slip out somewhere and then one of the notes will kind of get lost, you know. One to thee, one to thee, one to thee, one would suffice. Each one of those would have had a stimulus. It goes right down the seventh cranial nerve to the lip, and you won't have a breakdown in pitch. Now, as we learn to create phrase, so the audience hears phrase, we create the phrase, just like we would create messages out of single words, out of individual words. We can create a sentence. For instance, coming out today, I poked my nose out of the door and felt it was quite cold, and I went back and picked up my top coat. Then I thought I'd even take a hat. Now you can immediately picture me at the motel, sensing the cold and getting my top coat and my hat. That's a phrase. I had to use individual words and create that phrase. I cannot have the same aspect in producing the phrase that you had in hearing the phrase. Now, what about these young people? They're listening all the time to records, and there's a certain imitation of the phrase. There's a certain amount of that going on, and they're thinking the phrase, they're not thinking the building of the phrase. And as a result, they're not getting the proper reflex response somewhere in that phrase. They begin to lose the response patterns. You can see that.